I'm Esther Dillard on the Black Information Network, chatting with writers and authors who offer an added perspective for our listeners. This is The Color Between the Lines.
1, 2, 3, 4.
In this edition of The Color Between the Lines, we're speaking with author Steve Phillips about his latest book, How We Win the Civil War. Phillips is not only a New York Times bestselling author, but he is also a civil rights lawyer and columnist for The Guardian and The Nation. He's also a host of Democracy in Color with Steve Phillips. Thank you, Steve Phillips, for joining us on the BIN.
Thanks for having me on. I'm glad to be here.
Well, this is the second edition of the book with the same name. I spoke to you about the first one, and I was fascinated with the first one. And you mentioned in your interview, because January 6th happened shortly after the publishing of the book, there were a lot of things that you felt there were connections that you weren't able to address. Now you've addressed them. How is this book different than the first one?
So one of the main substantive pieces is I do address the midterm elections in terms of how to interpret that, what happened, both in terms of the House of Representatives and that how close that was, and the predictions of this red wave not coming to be, which if you had looked at the numbers, you would have seen, was in fact the case. So that really affirms that there is in fact a multiracial new American majority in this country, and that there's high turnout, that election results will go in that direction. And then I do address try to provide some analysis and understanding of what happened in Georgia, where Stacey Abrams did not win, but importantly and underappreciated, that Raphael Warnock did. And so I try to offer some analysis and interpretation of that situation in this book as well.
Well, this book really encourages anybody who's interested in politics and history to read several more books, because you mentioned so many different authors and offer so much information. You argue that the Civil War really never appeared to end because the power of kind of states' rights. Can you elaborate a little bit on this and what you think needs to be really done to try to address this?
And so, yeah, I originally had started it out when the publisher approached me about writing a second book. I said, let's use Civil War as a metaphor in terms of the level of division and really hatred that had been unleashed in the country, particularly since, Trump became president. But as I got into the research, that I began to understand that the Civil War, that the Confederates have quite literally never stopped fighting. And that, everybody knows that Lincoln was assassinated, but I didn't even know exactly when and exactly why. And so supposedly the Civil War ended on this Sunday in April 1865, when the surrender at Appomattox. 2 days later, Lincoln gives a speech at the Capitol, gives a speech at the White House. And John Wilkes Booth is there. His speech was outdoors. And he says, that means N-word citizenship. That is the last speech he will ever give. And then on that Friday, he goes into the Ford Theater and shoots Lincoln in the back of the head. That's not surrendering. And so literally from the very supposed surrender up to overthrowing Reconstruction in 1876 and handing the country back to the slave owners, who reinstated, in essence, white nationalism as the legal governing policy of the country for almost 100 years. So when I did the research, it was actually quite clear that the Confederates have never stopped fighting up and into today, including on January 6th. People carrying the Confederate flag, wearing sweatshirts saying MAGA Civil War, January 6, 2021, stormed the U.S. Capitol. So it's not metaphorical at all that the Confederates and their ideological and genealogical descendants are continuing to wage this battle over the definition of this country and who this country is for.
You make it really clear, that the mindset definitely, and all the different things that were kind of done after the Civil War, much of the laws and policies and things within some southern states and such really did, connect the dots in a way. And I wonder, you also mentioned in the book about the 2024 election and how this one is going to be extremely important, that will drastically change the future of this country. Why do you believe that this 2024 will be so important?
So that's one of the main things that's different in this book, is I have a new preface that where I draw from a conversation that Isabel Wilkerson had with Taylor Branch. She recounted in her book Caste, which was an incredible book. And they were talking about the incidents of white domestic terrorism under Trump in 2018. And he asked her, where do you think we are? Is it in 1950s or 1880s? So I take that framing to say, I think we're in 1876, where you had an election after a period of progress towards making America a multiracial democracy during Reconstruction. And we're going to go forward or we're going to go back again. And so the essence, I mean, I call my Trump chapter Make America White Again. I mean, the essence of his appeal is this attracting people who believe that this is fundamentally a country for whites, and by fanning the flames of white racial fears and resentment. So which direction are we going to go? And in a lot of ways, Trump was an accidental president in 2016, almost all the ways. He really had no expectation of winning. But he has now assembled people who want to carry out this agenda. What they're talking about in terms of they call immigration, but rounding up people to ship them out of the country by the millions is what they're putting in place plans to do. Putting them in camps is very not just evocative of, it's straight out of the playbook of what we did to the Japanese Americans in terms of the internment. So this is very much a battle over existentially. Is this going to be a multiracial democracy where we put the power of the government at the disposal of trying to make it work for everybody? Or are we going to make this primarily a white country and then get as many people of color out of the country as possible, which is what they have very specific plans to do?
I'm just showing you all the little notes that I put in this book.
Thank you. I love
And
to see that.
I honestly have to say, reading many of these historical accounts and the stories that you shared in this book were emotionally exhausting. Was it emotionally exhausting for you writing it?
It's interesting. It's interesting. I felt, because I wrote this in the middle of at the height of the pandemic. And so then I was an African American studies major in college. And I really felt a connection to writers who've gone before. And I felt a responsibility. I had all these books around me of people who had read when I was growing up to honor that tradition and also to honor the people who have made these struggles and sacrifices. And at one point, I wanted to just have multiple pages just listing the names of people who had been lynched in this country. It's like, how do you honor those people? So I don't think it was exhausting. And I think the other part of it was, so Andrea Guerrero was the featured people in the San Diego chapter. She had asked me when we were rolling it out, she says, what are you most excited about? And I paused and I was like, for my whole life, people have always said, well, yes, this people of color stuff is important, but we have to win. So that has to take a back seat. And we have to, make that, secondary. And then I was like, oh, wait, we're winning. We have one in Arizona, one in Georgia, one in Virginia, flipped Harris County, Texas, flipped San Diego. So that was very inspiring and exciting to me to be able to bring the stories of how we have won to the public. And so I drew a lot of inspiration and motivation from that.
I know we're running out of time, so I wanted to ask you about something that you talked about Stacey Abrams doing the long game tactics with politics. And what, in your opinion, what are some of the long game tactics that needs to be addressed if those who are wanting a multicultural democracy to exist?
Well, fundamentally has to do with what are we doing structurally to expand democracy, in that is really at the essence of the struggle. And then doing the research around the book that in Georgia and Mississippi and South Carolina after the Civil War, African Americans were the majority of people in those states. So they had to suppress the vote. And so that's been a cornerstone of their work ever since, all the way up to today. So what are we doing in a broad sense that has this long game around making voting and democracy as easy as possible? Same day voter registration. They did 24-hour voting and drive-through voting in Harris County, Texas. What are we doing in terms of using all the platforms that we have? 100 CEOs signed this letter opposing voter suppression. But why doesn't the president bring all of them to the White House? Why aren't we using the corporate platforms? Why doesn't every Amazon box have a number on it for how you can register to vote? Right. So things like that to be able to get voting embedded. It's like a crusade for democracy is really what's going to be the cornerstone of being able to, in fact, win this civil war.
This is a fascinating conversation. We could go on probably for a long, long time, but I want to say thank you so much for your time, Steve Phillips, for joining us on the BIN.
Thanks for having me. I enjoyed it.
And that's it for this edition of The Color Between the Lines. The book is How We Win the Civil War. I'm Esther Dillard on the Black Information Network.